Today I asked AI to predict the outcome of every 2026 Senate election. Specifically, I prompted ChatGPT to factor in each race's partisan lean, past results, incumbency, expert forecasts, demographics, political trends, and other key metrics, all to project the outcome of every seat on the map. And here are the results. Starting with the safe states. For Republicans, ChatGPT placed 11 states in the safe Republican column, meaning projected margins greater than 15 points. No surprises here. All 11 backed Donald Trump by more than 20 points in 2024, and Democrats haven't won a presidential or Senate race in any of them since at least 2008. Together, these bring the GOP to 42 seats, just 8 short of a majority. Remember, Vice President J.D. Vance can cast a tie-breaking vote, so Republicans only need 50 seats to control the chamber. They enter the 2026 cycle with 53 seats, meaning they can afford to lose 3 and still hold power. That's a big reason why the GOP remains the unanimous favorite among analysts and prediction markets, with Kalshi giving Republicans a better than 71% chance to retain the Senate next year. Now shifting to the Democratic safe column, ChatGPT identified 6 states with projected margins above 15 points: Massachusetts, Delaware, Rhode Island, Illinois, New Jersey, and Oregon. Again, no major surprises. Democrats have incumbents running in all but Illinois, and Republicans haven't won a statewide federal election, either presidential or Senate, in any of these states for over 15 years. Trump did come closer in New Jersey than any Republican since 1992, but with popular incumbent Cory Booker running, it's hard to imagine the GOP improving on that performance, let alone flipping the seat. Illinois tells a similar story. Trump lost by just under 11%, far narrower than his 17-point defeat 4 years earlier. Still, it would take an even bigger swing and half the time for Republicans to win here. With longtime Senator Dick Durbin retiring, Democrats lose the incumbent advantage, but with 2026 expected to be a more favorable environment, it's tough to see even a weak Democratic nominee losing. Those 6 states bring Democrats to 40 seats, giving them a smaller foundation than Republicans. That means they'll need to win at least 11 of the remaining 18 races to flip Senate control. The remaining 18 states are projected to be more competitive, with margins below 15%. The next group falls into the likely category, states where one party has a clear advantage, but an upset is still possible. For Republicans, that includes Kansas, Montana, South Carolina, Alaska, Iowa, and Nebraska. What separates these from the safe column are a mix of factors: recent competitive statewide results, a vulnerable incumbent, or a strong challenger. In Kansas, Senator Roger Marshall isn't a weak incumbent, and unless Congresswoman Sharice Davids is forced out of her House seat through redistricting and decides to run statewide, Democrats still lack a notable candidate. But the trend line is clear. Kansas is gradually slipping from its Republican stronghold. The state has shifted 11 points toward Democrats at the presidential level since 2012, tied for the second largest leftward trend in the nation. Trump's 15-point margin in 2024 was the narrowest for a Republican since Barack Obama's 2008 landslide. And the driver is clear. Kansas has one of the highest shares of college-educated residents among Trump states, 35%. Every state with a higher rate voted for Kamala Harris in 2024, except Utah, which is the only state to have trended further left than Kansas since 2012. That said, it's still very unlikely this seat flips in 2026. Kansas probably remains a decade away from true competitiveness, but the long-term shift is unmistakable. Next up is Montana. Steve Daines isn't a weak incumbent either, and Democrats haven't yet landed a big-name challenger. Still, Montana often punches above its weight in competitiveness below the presidential level. Democrats won a Senate race as recently as 2018 and the governorship in 2016. Daines won by 10 points in 2020, and while ChatGPT projects him to improve on that margin, it's not enough to completely rule out a Democratic upset. In South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham remains one of the most unpopular incumbents in the country, which drags his performance below what the fundamentals suggest. According to election blog Split Ticket's Wins Above replacement scores, Graham performed more than 5 points below expectations in 2020. Granted, his opponent, Jamie Harrison, raised more money than any Senate candidate in U.S. history at the time, and Graham still won by 10 points. Democrats have likely learned their lesson and won't pour that kind of cash into a near impossible race again, so a Graham victory remains very likely. In Alaska, the main question for Senator Dan Sullivan is whether former Democratic Congresswoman Mary Peltola decides to challenge him. She's still weighing a Senate run against a gubernatorial bid, but unless she jumps in, Sullivan should win comfortably. In Iowa, Republicans lose their incumbent with Joni Ernst's retirement, but quickly filled the gap with Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, a strong recruit who should win handily regardless of her opponent on the Democratic side. And finally, in Nebraska, we get the most interesting race of the bunch. Incumbent Pete Ricketts isn't a powerhouse, and the return of independent Cinderella candidate Dan Osborne has stirred concern among Republicans. He's already outpacing his fundraising total from last cycle when he came within 7 points of unseating another Republican incumbent, Deb Fischer. It's likely that 2026 will likely offer him a more favorable environment, but ChatGPT predicts an R plus 6.8 margin nearly identical to the 2024 result. With those 6 races added to the Republican column, they now sit at 48 seats, just too shy of a majority. 12 states remain, 3 of which fall in the likely Democrat category: Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia. In Colorado, Senator John Hickenlooper is expected to win re-election to what he said will be his final term. Similar story in Virginia, Senator Mark Warner should win a 4th term, though he said he'd serve only 2. ChatGPT forecasts Democratic margins of +11 and +6, but I'd personally expect both incumbents to ultimately win by double digits. New Mexico looks to be the closest of the 3, with Senator Ben Ray Lujan seeking a 2nd term. He underperformed fundamentals by nearly 3 points in 2020, and demographically, it's the most GOP-friendly of the trio. In opposite fashion to Kansas, New Mexico has the lowest share of college-educated voters among states Harris carried in 2024. Now together, these 3 likely wins bring Democrats to 43 seats, with fewer than 10 states still in play. Next, let's move on to the lean states, where ChatGPT is projecting a margin between 2 and 6 points. Here we find the 2 special elections of the cycle, one in Ohio to fill the remainder of J.D. Vance's term, and the other in Florida to fill Marco Rubio's. I consider both Republican appointees to be above-average candidates. While they don't have the full advantages of incumbency, both bring statewide experience. John Husted as Ohio's Secretary of State, and Ashley Moody as Florida's Attorney General. ChatGPT is more cautious on Moody's margin than I am. I could easily see her winning by double digits. She's that strong a candidate, having won by the largest margin of any major statewide contender in Florida this century. Ohio, on the other hand, could be genuinely close. Former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is running for the seat, and he's easily the strongest recruit Democrats could have hoped for. Without him, this race wouldn't even be competitive. For now, ChatGPT's R+4 projection feels about right, at least until we see more polling. Finally, Texas, where things couldn't have gone much better for Democrats so far. Senator John Cornyn faces a bruising primary against Attorney General Ken Paxton, which Kalshi's markets rate as a toss-up. The runoff potential adds more drama. If no one clears 50%, the top 2 advance to a late May runoff, delaying the GOP's general election push. Still, Texas remains fundamentally red. Trump's 14-point win in 2024 moved it firmly back into solid Republican territory. Even if Paxton wins the nomination, baggage and all, he'd still be favored over the Democrat. With those three holds, Republicans have officially crossed the majority threshold at 51 seats, ensuring Majority Leader John Thune can maintain control even with a defection or two. That leaves 6 states, all projected by ChatGPT to go Democratic. New Hampshire, Minnesota, and Georgia fall into the lean Democrat category, while Michigan, Maine, and North Carolina are in tilt Democrat, the latter two representing Democratic pickups this cycle. Starting at the top, Minnesota and New Hampshire have followed nearly identical trends over the past few elections. Trump came close to flipping both in 2016, losing Minnesota by just 1.5 points and New Hampshire by less than half a point, before they swung sharply back to Biden in 2020 by about 7 points each. In 2024, both settled roughly halfway between those margins, 4 points in Minnesota and 3 in New Hampshire. Now in 2026, with both incumbents retiring, Democrats are more exposed than they'd like in 2 must-hold states. ChatGPT is projecting margins of roughly D+5 in each, which feels fair, though I'd personally bet New Hampshire will be the closer of the two. Then there's Georgia, right on the border between tilt and lean Democrat with a projected D+2 margin. Senator John Ossoff remains a fundraising powerhouse, bringing in $11 million in the first quarter of 2025, the most ever raised by an incumbent in an off-year quarter. Back in 2020, he raised over $150 million to narrowly win this seat in a runoff, setting a national record at the time. Money isn't everything, but it certainly helps, and Republicans are unlikely to match that kind of firepower. Congressman Mike Collins, a far-right Freedom Caucus member and the current favorite for the GOP nomination, has underperformed expectations in both of his past House races. Now for the tilt Democrat races, starting with Michigan, another Democratic retirement makes this one tougher to hold, especially since Trump carried the state by just over a point in 2024. Republicans are likely to renominate former Congressman Mike Rogers, who still has his campaign infrastructure from last cycle when he came within 0.4 of a point of winning the Senate race. The Democratic primary remains wide open, not ideal since it delays the party's ability to unify behind a candidate and message. Still, Michigan has leaned left in statewide contests for the past decade. Republicans haven't won a U.S. Senate race here since 1994, and with 2026 expected to be a favorable year for Democrats nationally, perhaps D+3 to D+5, Michigan, with its even partisan lean, should follow that trend and stay narrowly blue. Next up are the 2 projected Democratic pickups, Maine and North Carolina, both sitting at the top of the DNC's target list. Fundamentally, Maine is the only Republican-held seat in a state Kamala Harris won, while North Carolina is the only GOP seat in a state Trump carried by single digits. In North Carolina, Democrats landed their strongest recruit of the cycle, former Governor Roy Cooper. He likely would have been competitive even against incumbent Thom Tillis, but with Tillis retiring and Republicans poised to nominate Trump ally Michael Whatley, Cooper enters as both the polling and betting favorites. In Maine, Republican Susan Collins remains a political outlier. In 2020, nearly every poll and analyst predicted her defeat, yet she beat Democrat Sarah Gideon by 8 points, even as Joe Biden won the state by 9. She's still the only Republican since 2004 to win a Senate race in a state carried by a Democratic presidential nominee. But 2026 may be her toughest re-election yet. Split-ticket voting is at an all-time low, and her approval rating, shown here via Nate Silver, has dropped to negative 16% net, the lowest of her career. Her likely challenger, Democratic Governor Janet Mills, is reportedly preparing a run and would enter with far higher favorability. Even if Mills sits it out, Graham Plattner, an oyster farmer backed by Bernie Sanders, would be a credible opponent. All things considered, Collins is probably the underdog right now. So with all of that said, the final prediction for the 2026 Senate map, according to ChatGPT, is Republicans with 51 seats and Democrats with 49. Feel free to share your thoughts on the map in the comments below and let me know what topics or races you'd like me to cover next. That's it for today's video. Huge thanks to my channel members, all listed in the description. Don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a like if you enjoyed the content. Check out more videos here, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.